In part 2, we'll be focusing on creating a flow that gets triggered when a bounced email notification is received in a shared mailbox, and then we'll create a document in CosmosDB. In part 2, we'll be using Power Automate, the CosmosDB connector, and the Office 365 connector. Objectives for part 2 are to create a connection to CosmosDB, add the Outlook and CosmosDB connectors, and add the trigger for the shared mailbox, as well as the ability to create a document in CosmosDB. Okay, so there's some important notes I need to call out about the out-of-the-box connectors here. The CosmosDB connector does not support the Mongo wire protocol. It only currently supports the SQL API. So if you need to have support for the Mongo wire protocol, you're going to need to create a custom connector for this. And I just so happen to do that in one of the later videos in this series. Also, the Outlook connector has limited support for shared mailboxes. So if you want to do things like move messages, you'll have to use the Graph API or create a custom connector for this. I'll also cover this in a later video. Okay, so the first thing we need to do before we actually build the flow is we need to ensure that we have a proper connection to our Cosmos DB. As you can see, I've already created that connection and I've logged into make.powerautomate.com. So let's just take a quick look at the connection here. If I do edit, you can see that we have authentication type set to access key, and then our account ID needs to point to our Cosmos DB account ID. And you also need to have your access key to your Cosmos DB account in order for that connection to be properly configured. So I'll come back over here and click on details. We'll see that status, it shows connected, and we can see who the owner is for this connection. So this confirms that the connection is currently valid. We need this before we can leverage the Cosmos DB connector. So this is a very, very important step. All right, so I've logged into Power Automate and I've actually built the flow. The flow is functioning fine. Just briefly, I want to explain the connectors and the actions that are needed to make this happen. You need to be using the when new email arrives in shared mailbox. You also need to be using a compose action, and you also need to be using either a create or update document v3 connector here, or you need to have a custom connector that exposes APIs for you to do this. So that's the details of what you need in terms of the actions, the triggers, etc. that are needed to make this happen. So in the next segment, I'll go into explaining each of the settings for each of these and why they're important. Okay, let's take a look at the settings for the trigger and the settings for the initialize variable, compose statement, and the create or update document v3 action for Cosmos DB. So we can see here in the trigger, I have the shared mailbox address. What I want to point out here is down here in the subject filter, I'm triggering on any message that has undeliverable in the subject of that message. This is one way that you can create triggers that are based on content of the message. There's also another option over here to do that as well via settings. So if you come down here to where are we at? So trigger conditions, we could add another option here and specify a different trigger condition here. But for this example, we don't really need to do that. So the next item here, I am initializing a variable called SC subject, which is a string variable, and I'm taking the subject line of this email that was triggered, and I'm just simply copying it into the string variable, and we will use this as part of our document DB document, and you'll see how that works briefly. So next I have a compose statement, and I'm simply composing a JSON document here, and I'm setting the ID property of this JSON document to a GUID, which is obviously a guaranteed unique ID. And next, I'm setting this subject attribute to the subject value of this message that we were triggered on. And then last but not least, I am posting that to DocumentDB. So keep in mind that connection that we created earlier, we need that, and that's what we're using here to establish and connect to Cosmos DB so we can create the new item. And next I have the database ID as well as the collection in which we want to send that data to. And last but not least, in the body, I'm sending the output of this compose statement, which will consist of this JSON document. So if I save this, and let's go and take a look at previous run history, and I'll just show you some examples of how this worked. So you can see here this flow was triggered and every item was successful. So we can see on the inbound message, we have outputs here. I'm not going to click on this because it will open in a separate window. And let's go ahead and move down the subject, and we can see that the subject variable is now equal to the value of undeliverable failure message. So you can see here that I literally sent a message to an invalid recipient, and this flow was triggered from that. And next I'm composing the JSON document. As you can see here in the outputs, this is a valid JSON document. And next I'm calling the Cosmos connector, and I'm literally sending a new document to Cosmos with this body data, which you can see here. We have a new GUID here, and we can see the subject is failure. And if I navigate over to Cosmos DB, we will now see a new record in Cosmos DB, our document over there with these values added to it. And that pretty much does it for the example. Thank you. I hope this was helpful. That concludes part 2. In part 3, we'll walk through the full demo of the flow we created in part 2.